Welcome to the Treachery of Data podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite-sized chunk of content summarizing a recent roundtable discussion topic. All right, so today we're going to be talking meta-analysis.
Some people place a huge amount of importance on it, but
Some
why?
people have built entire sites around it.
Yeah,
Multiple people
yeah,
have built
exactly.
entire sites
It
around
might seem like a dry subject to talk about, but it's actually really important because it sits at the top of the evidence hierarchy. So this is a pyramid employed by medicine and other fields to categorize and prioritize different types of research based on methodological rigor. And in terms of placement on the pyramid, it's higher than A/B tests, like that randomized controlled trials. And what meta-analysis is that it combines the results of multiple studies to obtain more precision and improve statistical power and reduce uncertainty. So for us web experimenters, the fact that it's way up there is it stands above A/B tests. It's really important to talk about because it apparently has more rigor than an A/B test. So that is super important to talk about.
What do you mean it has more rigor than an A/B test?
When you place something on the pyramid of evidence, quite low down on the evidence hierarchy is subjective opinion. Really high up on that pyramid is randomized controlled trials, so A/B experiments, what we run on websites. But meta analysis sits above that. So essentially, what we're saying is that if you've run meta analysis, that means it's a higher level of certainty and rigor than A/B tests. So therefore, if you're really sticking by your guns in terms of this meta-analysis you've done, you would release something without A/B testing.
There's alarm bells going off there of
Oh
like,
yeah, yeah. There's
oh,
alarm
if
bells going
if
off.
this is better than A/B testing, does that mean we just like m- grab a bunch of results of tests that other people have done, mush all that data together, and whatever gets spit out, that's what we do. So we don't need to test anymore, right?
Yeah,
That's
but
kind of what it sounds like, but I
yeah.
feel like you're playing a little bit of devil's advocate there. That's not really your opinion.
So let's dig a little bit deeper into what meta-analysis actually is, because key to the definition is this term systematic. It's a systematic review and analysis of multiple A/B tests or studies. So it and as part of that, it what it means is that it relies on precise calculations, rigorous procedures, and systematic rules to ensure accuracy and reliability. So just like A/B testing, we've got all of this statistical rigor and power calculations, all of this stuff that we need to do that we talk about a lot. There's a whole, not necessarily a whole different set of rules, but there's all sorts of procedures and systems and calculations and rules that we need to go through when it comes to meta-analysis, because a couple of key components, without going into the full sort of breadth of meta-analysis, are study selection and statistical analysis. So you couldn't, for instance, do like, to the point of statistical analysis, you when you're combining the data, you can't just go, oh, there's this test that's kind of positive, this test is kind of okay, this test is kind of all right as well. In general, I think it's a positive. That's not how it works. There needs to be a statistical process, a rigorous process, to combine the results together to give you a final output. And in terms of study selection, now this is where things get interesting, because what studies are you going to pick and which ones are you going to exclude? Because that has a huge. Whoa! Do you hear that?
What was
That's
that?
that was thunder. That was thunder.
Oh my gosh.
That's the world sort of telling us not to talk about meta-analysis. It's too spicy.
Holy heck! It sounded like, I mean, I know it's thunder is an explosion, but that it sounded like a like there was a car crash or something and like
Yeah,
exploded next to your house. Oh my gosh.
that is crazy. Yeah. So basically, like study selections. What studies are we going to pick, and which ones are we going to exclude? Because one of the big issues in the pharmaceutical industry and medicine industry debates and stuff like that is around study selection and publication bias. So this is where people picking and choosing specific studies to include in their data set when they do meta-analysis and excluding certain other experiment results, for instance. And then that produces a huge amount of bias. So there needs to be a rigorous process in place when you're picking the studies. We can get into it in more depth in terms of like, you know, where when it comes to A/B testing, what studies are we going to include and exclude?
Yeah, because that's kind of the trick, right? Is like you have to be very selective about what you're doing comparisons against. I had come up with a dumb analogy here in that an easy way that people say like you're not comparing like to like is saying, oh, it's apples to oranges, right? Like these are apples and these are oranges. They're not the same thing. You can't compare the two sets of information, right? And so with meta-analysis, it's the same kind of issue where you can't just take like somewhat similar test results. Like maybe they have the same hypothesis, but they are achieving a different solution. You can't just take the test results from all of those tests, even if the tests were run identically, like they have the same goal, like you literally copy pasted the configuration from site to site. You can't just add all of those numbers together because there's different conditions, right? Like not all of those sites have the same user base. They may not have the same amount of traffic. They probably are selling different products and serve different needs. Um, Even just assuming that like all of the sites tested were e-commerce, you can't just mush everything together, right? You're comparing apples versus oranges, and it's the same problem. You can't just like add 6 apples together with 4 oranges. You don't have 10 apples all of a sudden. You still have 6 apples and 4 oranges. Now you maybe have 10 fruit, but fruit is not what you are analyzing. You are analyzing apples. So
Yeah.
it's not a valid point of comparison.
And I think
Um,
that point about like if you're studying fruit versus studying apples, that's a really important point to make as well, because there's the context for which you approach doing meta-analysis. So if you're doing meta-analysis and you're talking about apples, and now you've got some oranges in the mix, and now you say apples have orange peels, and you start defining,
you start
you start
cheating what an apple is.
yeah, you start cheating and merging what an apple is with an orange. At a certain level, having apples and oranges in your meta-analysis would probably be okay, but at that level that you're talking about, it's not okay to have oranges in
Right.
that group.
Would you almost call that like reverse p hacking in a sense? Because you're like, instead of slicing the data down to find it, you're just adding more in to try and make it seem that it's like a more impressive result. So it's almost like you're doing the same thing except in reverse, which is also something that I wanted to kind of get into there, because you're talking about like, oh, apples, oranges, you're mushing data together. Well, what, right? Like, what about the inverse? Like when you have an A/B test result, but then you're doing segmentation analysis. Well, isn't like the totality of your data a meta-analysis of like all of the behavior of the different segments, right? Well, that also kind of proves the point, right? Like you do segmentation analysis to see what the differences are. Like, do new users versus returning users perform the same way? Desktop versus mobile traffic, all the other segments that you look at. And if you find a difference, what do? You retest under those conditions to validate, because that sample, like that segmented sample, was smaller than what your planned segment analysis was.
Yeah. So what you're doing is you're talking about the very all of the fine details and the procedures and the kind of steps of statistical rigor that we would go through if we were analyzing an A/B test. And that same kind of rule set applies when you're doing meta-analysis. And when we're doing A/B tests and randomized control studies, the objectivity element is super important. But now all of a sudden, if you want to start doing meta-analysis and you're the one who's picking the studies or the experiments that you're going to include in the meta-analysis, you're potentially introducing subjectivity, and that
Right.
is some bias that you're introducing into the mix. It's no longer objective, because did you include all of the studies? Do you have like enough of a cross section of all of the studies? All of the studies, are there even studies who are studying like the opposite, or just the fact that everybody was testing the same thing means that you've already got a biased sample because nobody was testing the other thing, or for instance. So yeah, just that fact of you now being in the role of picking and choosing the experiments that you're going to include or exclude introduces a whole level of subjectivity to the mix.
Right. And what we're kind of straying close to when talking about meta analysis is falling into the best practices trap, right? Like everybody knows that this works, so you should just do it and not evaluate. Which ye, it's also one of those things you have to evaluate on a case by case basis. Like, is it a best practice in the sense of like there's overwhelming evidence that says this works, or is it evidence that's built up over time? There's plenty of instances where like the common wisdom is just been it's almost like a social virus, right? Like it's just propagated because of popularity rather than it being accurately correct or not. Like Craig has talked all the time on the round table about studying legibility of all caps, in that like, is having text written in all capital letters actually harder to read or not? And there's actually just not good studies to indicate that, and it's more like it's just a common wisdom that's accumulated over time, right? It has sort of like the backing of time versus it actually being an accurate analysis. But we also don't want to necessarily argue against that either, because meta-analysis is useful within the realm of prioritization. you know so like if you're taking a sample, like that same sample of like, hey, we like this test has been run across 10 different sites, and it's assume that it's a well structured meta analysis. You've controlled for some outside variables and stuff, and you've evaluated consistency of this. Makes sense to put it together. They're similar enough overlap that this is okay to evaluate. And you know 8 out of the 10 tests showed that change positively affected performance. Okay, what is your interpretation, or what's the action that you're going to take as a result of that meta-analysis then? Are you just going to assume like, hey, 80% of the time it worked, so we're just going to do it too? Or is it that like, hey, this worked 80% of the time, so that means that this idea has a higher likelihood of winning, so we should prioritize it higher in our list. Like I think meta-analysis is a useful indicator of prioritiz like it should be applied to prioritization weighting, not necessarily direct action weighting. Like you should still run a test to evaluate like if this is the right thing for you to do, because hey, what happens if you're the 20% of the time that it doesn't work?
Why are you doing meta-analysis? I think that's really important, because if you're doing meta-analysis to write up something, to do a report on the effects of a discount panel on your website, and you've got various different experiments that you've run on your site with that panel on it, on various different pages of the flow, etc., etc. You can write up a like a report meta-analysis in terms of saying, well, we did this and this was the experiment, this was the result, and blah blah blah. But again, you can't go into, unless you've done that statistical rigor of combining the results and doing the statistical analysis to do that. Like, if you can't combine the results, then it's not true meta-analysis that you're really doing. What you're doing is really field research or heuristic analysis. So so basically lower down on that pyramid, that evidence hierarchy pyramid, is field research type thing where you're kind of looking at other experiments, other studies in order to determine what could be possible. And but it doesn't, that doesn't sit above A/B testing. It doesn't sit above randomized controlled trials. That's below. So you can use that to prioritize what you then run A/B tests on, which is higher up pyramid. What you can run meta-analysis on, and I've often done this, is if you run the exact same experiment a number of times with a different period of the time, for instance, 2 weeks in February, 2 weeks in March, or something like that. I don't know. And then
And
you can combine
to
the results,
qualify
and that
that a
is
little bit
true
further, though,
meta-analysis.
you're also like you mean running that same test on the same site.
Same test on the same site, yeah.
Yeah.
Exact same test on the exact same site. And I've done this before as well. You've got 10 different landing pages and you run the same experiment on all 10 landing pages, adding a specific panel, for instance. And all landing pages are pretty similar, apart from some minor differences in terms of what people may have searched for and then come onto the landing page. Say it's like a template that we need to decide whether or not it's going to go into the template for all 10 pages, then you can run a meta-analysis on that to say yes or no, it goes into the template, doesn't go into the template, etc. So I think that's another valid place to do meta-analysis, but it's a much narrower lane than I think people have given it credit for. But at the same time, that there's, it depends on the context of which you're doing it and what level you're going to go to. Um,
Yeah, especially in regards to like looking at other meta-analysis that people outside of your organization have done, or even more broadly, like looking at sites that collate test results together. Like, not we're not necessarily saying that like that is an unfruitful avenue to explore, but it's more like don't take it too far. Like interpreting someone else's A/B test results, it's the apples versus oranges. Their results are not the same as what's going to happen with yours. Well, I shouldn't say are not, are like are not necessarily likely to be the same, right? Because your site is not
yeah,
their
it
site.
doesn't beat
Your
A/B
site is
testing on your
apples,
side.
their site is oranges, right? So it may not be sufficient. You can use those as a great resource for ideation and prioritization of like, oh, hey, here's a list of test results that worked 80% of the time. Here's like 20 different ideas or hypotheses. Look through those, and how many of those have we tried, and how many of them would be valid for our use case. If they're all like landing page focused things, and you're on an e-com site that doesn't have like dedicated ad landing pages, like you drive your traffic to your product pages, well, that again, that's an apples to oranges comparison. You don't have landing pages, so those results aren't going to be valid for you.
It's the publication bias. Do you have the full
And
cross-sectional range of studies
right, where are they
to
getting those
compare?
results from? There
Yeah.
maybe plenty of other results out there. Like, can can you share your result? Do you share all of the results of your tests publicly all the time? You're probably under an NDA for some clients or something like that. Like, you can't just like, here, everybody take a look at my test database all that's right, like that's not something that you can do. And so right, there's some bias there, and like who's allowed or willing to share their result data for a meta-analysis of that type.
Yeah, and then the file drop problem as well. Like people will be more likely to share positive results or results very
Mhm.
specific reasons, but they'll be more likely to file away the losses or the inconsequential tests.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as always, if you have any questions, your feedback, or you disagree with something that we said, and I'm sure there's people out there that have disagreed with stuff that we've said today, you can always talk to me and Iqbal face to face at the CRO roundtable almost every Friday at conversionworld.co. I say almost every Friday because sometimes me or sometimes Iqbal isn't there for whatever reasons. We have to take vacations too sometimes. If you're shy or you don't like speaking, you can connect with us on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.